welcome to the NatCon podcast, Senator Matt Canavan. Matt has been a senator for the state of Queensland for just over 10 years now. He born and bred in Queensland. He was previously the Minister for Resources in Northern Australia in the Abbott and Scott Morrison eras. Is that right? Yeah.
Not Abbott. No, just Morrison and Turnbull.
That's right.
Good stuff.
You came into Parliament when
Tony Abbott was Prime Minister. Yeah.
Opposition. Yeah. So and Matt is well known in Australia, at least, for being a very forthright spokesperson on a variety of different issues, but also a very thoughtful guy. You started off in the Productivity Commission, right? That was your first job. You're an economist by training, and you spent a lot of time in Canberra, and you're back in Canberra, and all the rest of it. What are the things, as I was discussing just prior to getting on, we've established this National Conservative Institute in Australia because there's this global movement going on. There are conferences being held elsewhere in the world, but there hasn't really been very much here, if anything at all, to date. And so what do you know, Matt, about this national conservatism movement? What have you heard? What have you discussed or read? Or are you a little bit open, all ears about what it means?
Well, look, I mean, it's hard for me to define a label. I'll probably let others do that. I suppose there has been a shift, though, in the thinking of many people on the Conservative side of politics in the last decade or so, and I've experienced that shift while I've been a member of Parliament. I mean, I still distinctly remember just before I became a senator, I went to China with the beef company I worked with at the time, and it was Australia Week in China that week, and Tony Abbott was there and went to this massive lunch of probably 3,000 or 4,000 people, and there was great goodwill, and Tony was on the cusp of signing a free trade agreement with China. And I suppose that was still a continuation, we thought a continuation, of this so-called rules-based order and the continuing creep of a Washington free trade consensus going through the world, and that China was joining these capitalist countries and opening its economies up and removing state intervention, etc. Of course, that didn't end up being the next chapter in that book. It really was the epilogue almost. It was the end of it. And ever since then, there's been an awakening, I think, or a reckoning that not everybody is playing by the rules. Not all countries share our particular vision or ideas of how things should be run. And if we are gullible enough to convince ourselves they do in fact share those views, that can do enormous damage to the strength and position of our own country and interests in the world. So I think that's what the awakening has been, that looking back now over the last few decades, there was a lot of naivety that influenced the acceptance of China into the World Trade Organization, with only really Clayton's type conditions that were never enforced. There's been a lot of naivety about the position of Russia in Europe and the defence of European countries. And while we've started to wake up here, the same principle here holds, that we have not been spending enough on our defence forces, that we've forgotten that there are still countries in the world that may do things against our interests from time to time. They pursue their own narrow interests, and we need to respond to that. So I think that's what's been the shift in the thinking of the Conservative parties, that we need to get back to ensure our own national interest first, our national strength first, and putting our country first. That has taken a while, perhaps in Australia, longer than others. We've probably had the luxury of a period of prosperity where we've been able to hold on to the convenient, comfortable truths of a previous era for longer than in Europe and America, where they've faced a much tougher economic situation since the global financial crisis.
Yeah. So, I mean, trade is one of the key areas where there has been this change. You go back to 2016 and when Trump recently got elected and sort of shook things up a bit. And there was Scott Morrison, then Prime Minister, was giving speeches at the Lowry Institute, basically assuring everyone that it's always going to be the same. We're going to be open trading regime and programming continues as per normal. And I noticed just the other day, Scott Morrison returned from Washington for some meeting over there, and he said, "Oh, he understands now why there needs to be the US is imposing tariffs on China." Tony Abbott, who was responsible for signing the free trade agreement with China, he now says that. Well, he first says that it should be on the basis of strict reciprocity, which isn't actually what the agreement says. And then he says, "I don't think I would have been able to sign the agreement now, um, like I did then." But he doesn't actually say we should change it or we should tear it up or adjust it. And it's very left in very general terms. And certainly among the business community as a whole in Australia, there's still this sort of celebration that we've stabilized, which is the new buzzword, our trading relationship with China. We are, effectively, although there are sort of slight exceptions to the rule because of anti-dumping and other actions that can be brought, we have basically 100% of Chinese manufactured goods can come into Australia duty-free, right? So, and we make these sounds, like you say, about, we've got to invest in critical infrastructure or minerals or defense and defense-related industries. But my question is this, like, is it really possible for Australia to have a manufacturing industry as long as you can effectively import manufactured goods duty-free from China?
Well, I don't think it's possible for us to have a strong one if we continue like this. I mean, we'll still have pockets of manufacturing. I'm not suggesting the whole industry will go. We have certain natural advantages and domestic markets we can serve, but large swathes of our manufacturing industry will clearly not survive if we continue as we're going. And as we're going, the status quo is that China subsidizes its manufacturing industries with gay abandon and doesn't really seem to have any restraint in terms of WTO rules, free trade agreements it signs. It continues to flaunt those conditions and requirements, and then effectively dump at least, even if legally the definition is not met, but dump those products on the rest of the world, including our own country. And so, we've got this absurd position now, Dan, where we are the world's largest exporter of iron ore and coking coal, the two major inputs into the production of steel. Yet we only produce enough steel to serve half our needs. We import around half our steel now from other countries. We have just 2 steel mills left in Australia. Both of them at various times have required significant government support to continue. And we don't seem to have a really long-term plan about how to tackle the fact that China has got 60% of the world's steel market through massive subsidies, energy subsidies primarily, to its steel industry. I mean, I believe, and I've said this for a while now, since COVID at least, that we really do need to work with the rest of the world to rebalance markets like steel, so that there is a greater diversity of production across the world and it's not concentrated in one country. We can play a big role in steel and other commodities where we have the resources, because we have the natural resources to help other countries grow their steel production. We should also, I think, quite clearly have a target that we produce enough steel for ourselves. Now, that's not going to rebalance global markets all that much because we're a pretty small consumer of steel overall. But as I say, we should be working with other like-minded countries to fix this up. It wouldn't be the first time this happens. This has happened many times in the past. The whole European Union itself it had its origins in steel agreements to share steel production across Western Europe post World War II. And so we should be looking at something similar in resource economics here. So I think that if I come back to what your original question about national conservatism, there probably is a different flavour to it here in Australia, because it's not isolationist. I mean, we can't be an isolationist country. We're just too small for that. We can't be autarkic. We have to have relations and trade with other countries, but it is about focusing on trade and preferencing trade with like-minded countries, with countries that are not going to turn around and break the rules and do harm to our own strength and economy by doing so. So, we should be looking for agreements like that in those types of commodities. If we want a strong manufacturing sector in this country, we need to put more protection on our own domestic industry at least in regards to subsidised and illegal or legal under the trade agreements production from China.
Right. So I was just thinking it through. We have this big thing. There's been this made in Australia, future made in Australia policy announced by the current treasurer, Jim Chalmers, and its focus is on building things and again in Australia, manufacturing in Australia, and the previous government, coalition government in Australia, were also focused on that. There's an appetite in the community for people. We don't build anything. Let's sort of build stuff. But I mean, can you really, isn't it the worst of all possible worlds where you throw all this money at solar panels in the Hunter or what God knows what else they have in mind, but essentially you're still not preventing products, not only from China. It's not, China is the focus. So, I mean, it's sort of easy to get people to understand there's a sort of a geopolitical element to it all. But NAFTA in the United States was Mexico, which sort of hollowed out a lot of the manufacturing base there. It's not simply that China has a different political system, which is the issue. It's a when China joined the WTO, and I remember it well because I was in Shanghai, and we were. I remember distinctly a discussion I had with a journalist friend of mine. We were sitting down in 2000, and we we're all sort of newly minted grads, and we're all Adam Smith and comparative advantage. And yes, it'll be tough. And but I remember sitting down with her, and she was working for I think CNN at the time. And beside her at dinner was a cameraman, and he was a sort of much more kind of rusted on sort of dude. And I was like, oh, what do you think? And he says, I think it'll be a disaster. I was like, oh, no. Where are you from? Oh, I'm from Ohio. I'm from the. And so in retrospect, it's like, well, 2 lessons for me is like,
well, I suppose the other thing is different. If we could just segue a little bit here, the big difference for Australia is we haven't ended up with a lot of Clevelands or Detroits or Manchesters or Birminghams. We've been lucky in that regard that there are pockets of that in Australia. I'm not dismissing that. Parts of Adelaide and Melbourne in particular aren't the manufacturing powerhouses we used to have. But the entrance of China into the World Trade Organization, we have to recognize, economically helped us enormously because it powered our mining industry. And for a lot of from a social perspective, a lot of the people that previously would have looked for jobs in manufacturing sectors in Australia have had this wonderful outlet of having a job in the mining sector here in Australia, and a very good paying job, admittedly, maybe in a different part of the country. So that's been, from an economic sense, a wonderful plus for Australia, and that perhaps is another reason why we're not quite down the same path as you might see in Europe and North America. We don't have the kind of Rust Belt type districts that are politically so powerful in those countries. But that doesn't absolve this broader point, the strategic point that we're talking about here, that we have, as a consequence of that, lost enormous amounts of our own manufacturing industry. And while it hasn't had the same human and social impact as in other countries, we're still now a country that, let's face it, we're not as able to defend ourselves industrially as we were 20 years ago because of this competition we've faced. And that's something that has to be rectified. And you're right, both sides of politics want to do that. And I'm happy to maybe expand and get back to the topics you're talking about now, about how I don't think government subsidies is the way to go here. It's just not going to work. The balance sheet's not big enough of the Commonwealth to fix it. We have to have a different approach.
Right. And so why we kind of, what would be wrong with, as Trump is proposing? I mean, the United States, I feel like in Australia, we focus on the antics of these individuals, and they're interesting in their way, J.D. Vance or Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or God knows who else. But there's not as much of an engagement with the actual ideas, or to the extent that there is. For example, Trump's imposing across the board 10%, 30% tariff and 200% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Biden has already imposed 100% tariff on EV Chinese vehicles. I read somewhere the other day, there are more electric vehicles in Australia that come from China than there are in the entire United States, which is a kind of mind-boggling statistic. Um, but what we make all these arguments, at least on the, and I'm pretty familiar with them all. Well, if we want to manufacture, we just need to get our energy cheaper, which is true. The energy costs are very important, or we just need to get better industrial relation, more flexible industrial relation regime. But why? I know it would impact and would require changing a lot of the framework that we've benefited from in some ways, but at some point, aren't we going to have to bite the bullet and say, for not just for defense purposes, but to maintain a sort of some level of sovereign industrial capacity, it's important that we are able to in Australia make fish hooks or shoes or shirts, these types of things, which aren't strictly or narrowly within a kind of defense industry sector, but are nevertheless important to have some control over your
Look, I agree. I agree. I suppose the problem we've got at the moment is there's this counter track where our manufacturing policy is being subordinated to the priorities of the climate change agenda. And so most of the government subsidies, which I think are largely ineffective, as I said, are going into building plants to build solar panels or batteries or some such. It's not exactly clear how a solar panel is going to help us defend our country. As I constantly joke now, I mean, if anyone does want to invade Australia now, they don't need a map. They just need a weather forecast on a cloudy and windless day. Will be very vulnerable because our electricity system is now totally dependent on the weather conditions that exist on a particular day. So that to me, it just seems the wrong priorities. I mean, if you want to defend your country, as we've seen in the Ukraine, with all the talk about cyber and all this stuff, ultimately a lot of it comes down to the basic ability to produce large quantities of industrial material, be that just basic artillery shells, like 57 millimeter artillery shells. That's really, really important. Be it the ability, and you need steel for that. You need a manufacturing supply chain to do that. Be it now more advanced technologies, admittedly, but still just a manufactured good in something like a drone. These are the things that we need to be able to concentrate on. As I come back to the fact that we have the raw materials for this, like steel, like copper, and we should focus on those things to start with and build from there into an actual what is needed for our defence industry. What I suppose we haven't done properly yet is marry the priorities of our defence forces to the industrial strategy of our country. I know my colleague Andrew Hastie is doing a lot of work on this, but our defence officials have tended to focus almost exclusively on procurement of the latest technology. Of course, the biggest one at the moment being the nuclear subs through AUKUS, but not a lot on how industry policy settings need to be married to the defence priorities of this country. There's not a lot of communication between those departments or priorities that I see in Canberra, and I think that needs to change. There's a lot more communication and cooperation between the Department of Climate Change and the Department of Industry than there is between the Department of Industry and the Department of Defence. And I think that's a bit of a problem for our country.
Yeah, although I'm not sure. Maybe to focus in a bit further. I mean, there was a discussion I was reading the other day with Oren Cass, who's a guy, public intellectual in the United States, and they were saying that, look, the point is not. There's two different types of schools of thought. One is, I think they call it like the closed garden approach, where you allow open free markets in trading arrangements and everything else, but you try to protect key technology or key military related industry so that you can defend yourself using that, but then everything else, shoes, hats, toothbrushes, that can be openly traded. It doesn't matter whether you produce that or not. And that, I think, that's a position held by some in the United States, but I think the one now which is now changing, which I don't think it's really seeped in here yet, or at least hasn't been accepted, is that it's very hard to sustain, to have a to really you can't kind of quarantine it in such a small way, your industrial capacity just for defense, because you need shoelaces and fish hooks, and you don't actually you need nuts and bolts. You need I remember, again, in Hong Kong back in the day, in Australia Day, Peter Costello was at an Australia Day lunch, and he got up the front there and he said, I'm hearing these American executives say that China's going to produce all our cars if we continue like this. And I think, Adam Smith comparative analysis shouldn't really matter. You know, it does sort of matter if someone's producing all your cars or all sorts of other things, even though a car is a consumable item, because, as during World War II, all that, the arsenal of democracy, all those GM and those companies changed what they were producing from cars to tanks, or they changed what they were producing from skirts to uniforms. It matters, and America succeeded in those wars because it just had such a vast and wide industrial kind of capacity, which it built up behind protected markets, right? Like it didn't build those up.
Well, I mean, look, I think we have to face reality as well here. There is, as I kind of said earlier, there's no way we can produce all those things ourselves. It's just not going to happen. Like we can't be an autarkic country, and I don't think that's what.
I mean, we're not talking autarky like North Korea style, and we're not talking those. I find those words are like bandied around, right? And they don't. I feel like, we did produce shoes, shirts, cars.
Not very efficiently. I mean, I don't think that's possible. I don't think we need to do that. There is, okay. I mean, if we really put our mind to it, obviously we could do most of these things. I'm not trying to say that. It's just that it will be very, very expensive, and we'll be much poorer for it. We won't be a stronger country, which is the priority here, is to be a strong nation who can defend ourselves. What I suppose you said a closed garden, I'd probably prefer a shared garden where we share it with countries that are like-minded, that we can trust and have faith in. So there are other countries I'm got no problem buying or relying on them to buy shoes or fish hooks or shoelaces, whatever it is. There are other countries absolutely like China, who have shown themselves that they can't be trusted. Can't be trusted with just a basic free trade agreement we've signed with them. They can't be trusted around the security and peace and prosperity along the Taiwan Strait. Obviously, Russia's in the same camp as well now. And so we need to make sure that our shared garden is largely one that's only reliant on other countries we can trust. And so it's not saying that we have to go back to the same world we had 60 or 100 years ago. I do think that the changes that occurred in the last 30 or 40 years to open up markets, to reduce our protection, were largely a good thing. It's just that the world has changed now with the emergence of an aggressive and self-interested Chinese Communist Party, and we need to respond to that. We need to respond in a measured and balanced way that doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
But do you think, when after NAFTA in the United States, talking Mexico, so not China, but other, developing, quote unquote, developing countries that have very, very low labor costs, does that make sense? Did that make sense?
I mean, I don't have a problem with that at all, because again, coming back to our principles as a country, we're lucky. We're blessed in natural resources. So if there's a particularly labor-intensive type of production that occurs, it really makes no sense to do it here. I mean, we can't. I mean, I don't think it's right to say that somehow all the principles of Adam Smith and economics are wrong and should be all thrown out. They're not. There's a lot of wisdom in those things, and clearly wisdom that's been shown in the last 40 or 50 years. I mean, as I say, the economic performance of Australia during this period of economic liberalisation, deregulation, has been astounding. It's almost never been as prosperous and successful, at least in modern recorded history. We have never experienced such a consistent period of economic growth and prosperity for our country. So there's something good in it. There's something good. And as I come back, we don't want to throw all of that out the window. But there is some negative aspects of it, as I say, particularly as I keep harking back to the concentration that China's got themselves into very key and strategic markets. And so I think we should be clear-eyed about what we want to achieve. And not try and do everything. Like most things in life, if you try and do everything, you'll end up doing nothing, almost certainly. So we should be very targeted and strategic about what we do as a country, as a small country, but with a lot of resources.
Yeah, but we can be targeted, but tariffs of whatever shape can't be considered, because that's really where the rubber hits the road.
I'm sorry. We didn't quite get onto that, but I was suggesting absolutely I agree with tariffs. I wrote a paper for the Nationals Party a few years ago, where you mentioned what do we need to do to get manufacturing back. And in simple summary terms for this podcast, there were two things, I think, in that paper that we highlighted that the most important things to do. One was to lower our energy costs. I think that's a necessary condition, but not sufficient. And secondly, to put tariffs on countries that break the rules, like China. Absolutely.
Mm.
Now, again, that should
Break
be
the,
not,
but break
not,
the
not
rules,
again. That
but not.
should be. Well, I don't think that we should let the rules restrain us anymore because the rules are already being broken.
Mm.
So, we've got to play by the rules that the rest of the world is playing by, including the United States now, and we have to face that reality. There's this mantra. There's lots of mantras that are sort of set in Canberra now that I think help people sleep at night almost. And one of those mantras is a rules-based order, and we need to respect the international trading rules. It's like, what rules? I mean, no one's abiding by these rules, and especially not the big players. And even
Mm.
if they weren't, at the moment, there's actually no arbitration system in place to enforce the rules. It's dead.
Mm.
And it's dead thanks to the United States, may I say. It's not China in that regard. The United States are refusing to appoint people to the arbitration board of the WTO. And so while we took China to the WTO for its clearly illegal sanctions on many of our products in the last few years, in fact, there was actually nothing that we could ultimately end up with through that appeal process. It was kind of for show, or a sort of to try and force some embarrassment, not a proper legal process. So look, I absolutely agree with that. I just don't think we should necessarily put tariffs willy-nilly across every product in this country. That would be the wrong move. It would be a knee-jerk reaction, and as I say, would make us poorer.
Mm. So we'll always rely on toothbrushes and shoes from
Well,
elsewhere.
I don't think we should have a government bureaucracy deciding, yes, we rely on
Mm.
toothbrushes and that sort of thing. We used
Mm.
to. The predecessor of the Productivity Commission was a Tariff Assistance Board, and it used to do that. It used to look at,
Mm.
I think it did look at raises at a whole
Mm.
inquiry once, and what the appropriate tariff should raises be. And I think
Yeah.
we've got to be very careful not going back to that sort of ridiculously planned economy. There's some pretty simple key strategic commodities and resources we should focus on, work with the rest of the world to do that. Some of this work is going on, right? It is
Mm.
going on, like through the critical minerals process that I
Mm.
kicked off as resources minister. This
Yeah.
government's continuing that. We're working with the US and other countries to do these things. There
Mm.
has been, admittedly, slow but steady progress on that. So the world's moving in this direction. It's just a matter of keeping the momentum going there. And as I say, not get distracted with things like climate change, which, in my view, have the ability of scuppering this attempt to re-establish a degree of sovereign capabilities in Western like-minded countries,
Mm.
because China, of course, is taking massive advantage of the rest of the world's gullibility on issues like net zero emissions.
Mm. I won't spend. It's an interesting, because of your background. It's really interesting to discuss the trade element of it all. But I won't move on to some of the other stuff. But critical minerals, and you were the resources minister. I just noticed the headline today: lithium producer Albemarle basically scaling back its production. That was going to be one of the great kind of hopes, that we would do much more processing of minerals, critical minerals here, and then obviously there's the nickel sector, which again was a great
Yeah.
hope. Was classified, I think, eventually as a
Can I
critical.
say something about nickel? I think nickel's very instructive. Lithium's a little bit different, but nickel. I mean, nickel is sort of a demonstration par excellence of what the points I'm trying to make here. Yes, nickel. Well, nickel actually wasn't originally in this
Okay.
government's critical minerals list, but they have added it. And our corporate sector, led by BHP. It's not just the government here that's sinning in this environment we're talking about, but our big corporate BHP had decided that green nickel was the future. But because a lot of the growth in nickel demand would come from the batteries that go into electric cars, that it would be very important that the production of such nickel be done in a environmentally sustainable way. The idea being that consumers of Teslas would demand that all the commodities that make up their batteries and their engines and their vehicles be broadly sustainable. So BHP put really cost and efficiency to one side and focus just on that green agenda. Meanwhile, China teamed up with Indonesia and built a massive amount of coal-fired power stations. Now, this is almost unbelievable statistic, but you can go and check it yourself. Indonesia in the last 2 years. So 2 years ago, Indonesia went to Glasgow just 2.5 years ago. went to Glasgow, signed up to net zero emissions. One of the countries say, yeah, we'll have a net zero emissions target. Came back, and in just 2 years' time, in 2022 and 2023, we've got data up to the end of last year, they increased their coal mining, they increased their use of coal for electricity production by 57% in 2 years. And they're already a large user of coal, so 57% growth off a very large base. It's astounding, and that fueled largely the construction of a huge number of nickel smelters. And Indonesia now has more than half the market. BHP's had to announce the shuttering of its nickel production facilities that include a refinery and mines in West Australia. That's 3,000 jobs. 1,000 jobs had already gone, and we're facing also another 5,000-6,000 because a lot of mines use that refinery. And so it's just a disaster, an absolute disaster that's been led by this green agenda that's distracted our attention, the attention of governments, the attention of our big corporates, away from the hard strategic realities of the world. They've just entered into a fantasy land that's hard to consider that hard-nosed business people would get themselves into this mess. BHP made a speech to the Melbourne Mining Club late last year where they kind of had to admit that this green premium they were hoping for in nickel markets has not materialised, and they're in big trouble now. So, look, I mean, hopefully it's a wake-up call. Although I don't know, mate. It doesn't seem to be, the alarm doesn't seem to be sounding loud enough yet. And you just briefly compare that to the history of that company, BHP. In the 1930s, it was led by a guy called Essington Lewis. He went to Japan in 1936. He saw how drastic the situation was. Came back to Australia and set up an aircraft company with a bunch of other Australian businessmen, which eventually produced the Wirraway warplanes in World War II. Within a decade, were producing warplanes. That was BHP in the 1930s, and BHP, nearly 100 years on, is now a company that seems co-opted by political agendas that are just unrealistic and don't exist in the real world. It's very, very sad.
Yeah, I mean, again, just not to harp on about it, but if we get cheap power, nuclear power in WA to help, which can be provided to those nickel processing plants,
nuclear is not going to cut it. Nuclear's not going to
no.
cut it. I mean, I like we're as guilty as this too, right? We're not serious. Like, we're latching onto nuclear. Why? On my side of politics. I fully support getting rid of the ban. I've got a bill in the Senate to get rid of it. We should build some nuclear power stations. They'll help. They'll help our system. But we're latching onto it as a silver bullet, as a panacea, because it fixes a political issue for us that it's low emission and it's reliable. But it ain't the cheapest form of power. I mean, Indonesia, if it was that cheap, Indonesia would be building those to power the nickel smelters. They're not stupid. They're focused on cost. They're building coal-fired power stations because they're much, much cheaper. So if you want to have nickel, if you want to have aluminium, if you want to have steel in this country, you need coal-fired power stations. If you don't want to build them, well, you've got to face facts. Choices have consequences.
Yeah.
And so if you want to make the choice to not build coal-fired power stations, you're not going to have large sections of our manufacturing industry in this country. You're going to have to import that stuff.
Yeah, people want to have their cake and eat it too. I mean, it's
absolutely.
Yeah. And Nick, I think Indonesia, if I'm not incorrect, also did impose limits on the export of raw materials to China.
Yes, they did.
Processed then. So, obviously we're not going to impose blanket bans on, iron ore, God forbid, because it would, everyone has to be realistic about where our bread is buttered. But, again, we are the odd man out when it comes to, electric vehicles, right? The EU now has effective.
That's not true. I mean, I'll disagree with you there. I'll just disagree with it. We could impose some restrictions on iron ore, right? I mean, we export 1 billion tons of iron ore. To do what I'm suggesting, that we increase our steel production from 6 million tons to 12, so double it, and that would do our domestic needs. We'd need roughly 9 million tons of iron ore out of that billion. I think that's reasonable. I don't think it's going to destroy the iron ore industry.
I think at one stage you argued for an export levy or something on.
Yeah, I did. That was where China's since back down, but my views get tough with China on these illegal bans. Taking them to the WTO was nothing, but yes, okay, you guys put bans on our products. We'll make you pay for it because you've got to buy our iron ore. They never sanctioned our iron ore, obviously, so we've got to put an export levy on the iron ore to help subsidise the wine industry and others that were suffering from the Chinese bans.
trying to execute a seamless segue into another area, foreign affairs, because I always think trade actually is too much understood as a pure economic issue and rather than an element of foreign policy. But in foreign policy generally, one of the other areas where the NatCon guys and have a critique basically of the last, post Cold War, centre right and bipartisan consensus generally is we've had all these foreign interventions by Western powers, Serbia, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere. And those that were in favor of it, and I was in favor of, Iraq war, got to get Saddam and all that sort of stuff, build democracy. And the people who were saying things at the time, no, it's not going to be like that. You can't impose this Jeffersonian democracy in a country with very different culture to our own. We're kind of, by me, I'm sure many others, but kind of, it's a bit, pessimistic or whatever. But those in time were sort of the guys who really we should have been listening to. And there doesn't seem to be enough kind of a reappraisal about how this, I call it like, reckless evangelicalism. We're always like in favor of like, save, it's the next flavor of the month and we're off to save God knows who. And it ends up over time, despite a lot of public enthusiasm to begin with, in a lot of blood lost, treasure, a lot of prestige lost. And I just feel like there just needs to be a new realism. And that is what people like, I think JD Vance had something the other day. He was saying, look, not everything is our business. We don't have to get involved in every effectively ethnic dispute. And so, what do you think for the last 30 years? There's something to that.
I mean, sounds like I've gone through the same metamorphosis yourself, Dan. Yes, I mean, I was at university when September 11 happened. And yep, I was gung-ho that we needed to make people pay for what was an outrageous crime against a free country and an ally of ours. And so, yes, fully supported going into Afghanistan, Iraq, and now, 20 years on, realised that was a massive mistake, at least in regards to Iraq, but also ultimately what happened in Afghanistan was probably a good reason to go into to seek to cut off Al Qaeda's capabilities, but the consequence, the sort of utopian idea that we could build nation building and all that agenda was not very conservative when we look back on it, and ultimately ended in tears for so many people. Terrible situations around the world. We're still living with today the consequences of that, particularly out of the Iraq War. So look, it should be a lesson for us, instructive lesson, that there are always limits to power. It's a good conservative principle. Of course, we should seek to do what we can to spread peace and prosperity around the world. But I think we need to recognise there are limits to what we can achieve. There are limits to what we can do. And the world's never going to be a perfect place. It's, I think, a key part of conservatism that we approach it in the sense that there's no perfection to be achieved on this earth, that we have to just make the best of a bad situation. So I do think that an injection of more realism would be great. Not sure the current US administration are applying that in regards to Ukraine in particular. And there is then now a risk of a wider conflict emerging. I think the biggest risk to the world is a nuclear war, is World War III, much bigger than climate change. Obviously we, like every human being on the world, has a direct interest in making sure doing everything to avoid that happening. And I think one way of avoiding that happening is to put aside these utopian, very self-centered, let's face it, perspectives about the world. And seek to have friendly relations. I mean, we've spoken a lot about, say, for example, China over the first half of this, and my main objection to China is what it's done on the trade and economic front to take our jobs, to take our industry, and done so in a hand way, and we should respond to that. But I want to have friendly relations with China. I think there's no reason why, if we can't work together and productively, we can't have a very strong economic partnership. We obviously have a lot of corresponding needs that we can work on, and obviously at a military and defence and security perspective, we want to be a strong voice for peace across the whole world. I think that is achievable with a much greater degree of realism and sense and common sense than what we've seen in the last couple of decades.
Yeah, I mean, JD Vance has that line. Look, the worst possible policy with respect to China is that they make all our stuff and we go to war with them. That is the posture still in Australia. Like, we're all quite butchy in many sections about, beefing up, and that's all. It's important that we're, but
I think we need to make sure, and I do see this. There's some senior commentary. No, it's not the position of the Australian government, in my view, but some senior commentary from both within government and on the fringes of it, almost suggesting that war with China is inevitable. And I think that's a disastrous perspective. I don't think it's inevitable at all. It comes down to choices we make, and how we approach these tough and difficult issues. But I don't see it as inevitable at all. I think that's far too pessimistic. We obviously need to, as we've spoken to, defend ourselves and build up our own capacity, just in case anything happens. We don't know, anything could happen, so we've got to have that insurance policy. But we should obviously be working to achieve the best outcome, which is the continuation of the relative peace that we've had on a worldwide scale since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah. How do you, on the foreign policy question and whether to intervene or not, how do you, make the argument to an emotional public who sees images of, atrocities of people that, in Ukraine or elsewhere, and with respect to Ukraine in particular? I mean, this is, you certainly have, whether it's Boris Johnson or Tony Abbott striking these Churchillian poses and saying they've got to fight to the last man and the last, where, I don't know. I mean, to me, that seems like there's one thing to be in favor of doing what you can to preserve a rule-based order. And there's another thing to defend your actual country from a direct threat. And there is going to be like an area where, there are situations where you might be doing something which doesn't not simply in response to an attack on your country. But what's the front? How can you?
I mean, I suppose we are somewhat lucky to take an optimistic approach to this. We're lucky that we have recent examples of that type of imperialistic almost rhetoric going very, very wrong. I mean, we can only have to point to people to what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan, that let's not repeat those same mistakes. That we all remember George W. Bush getting on an aircraft carrier saying mission accomplished, and still not accomplished. It's still a complete mess, Iraq and that whole region. So that approach, that bulldozer approach, is not always the right one. I suppose the harder thing for us all is that we still seem to be always living in the 1930s. We can't, as a culture, as a civilization, it's always 1938.
Everything's a new,
whatever year you want. Exactly. Everything is presented through that crux, and I think that is part of that. Let's face it, and one of the reasons why we should be cautious is that is the last time that you can really say that the Western world successfully fought a war. Every conflict we've had since then has been, at the very least, maybe mixed result, or been so unimportant not to really register. But any major conflict since that time has not been a clear and unambiguous victory for Western countries. And I mean, look, the one immediately after World War II, Korea, was still a problem 70 odd years on. So we've got to have some, maybe that will, after 70 years, cause us just to pause a little bit, that not all wars end like World War II. Not all wars should be fought in that way. Not all conflict should be resolved in that way. There are other approaches to take. So I think there's two tracks here. One is the recent history to convince people, and the other is, well, let's hope, and that we teach enough kids history, like teach them proper history about what happens when people's rhetoric, when people's desires go far beyond their reach, goes far beyond their grasp. It's completely disastrous for countries when that happens.
Yeah, we haven't had the, like you said, since World War II, the signing in Tokyo Bay type of conclusion to a military conflict. We've had, I guess, I was just thinking off the top of my head. I mean, Thatcher beat the Argentinians. That's a kind of a
Yeah,
victory.
well, I would say that goes to that column. It's hard to register the Falklands Islands. I mean,
That's
I
no,
wouldn't be
agree.
able to I vaguely know where they are on a map, but
Yeah,
not
yeah, no,
precisely.
I take your point, but it's because war has been able to be waged without actually probably in a way that greater way that people have in prior centuries been able to
Yeah,
do.
they're remote. They're not the large scale conflicts, obviously, but even
Mm.
other conflicts like Libya, you've
Oh
mentioned it,
yeah.
Libya,
No, what I'm trying
Iraq.
to say
I
is
mean,
that
even Serbia in a way. I mean, there's still disputes about that at the moment.
absolutely,
It's
yeah,
still a sore point. It's
yeah,
and so it's hard to say. Okay, that intervention was really good. That military action led to a better world.
of course,
So when you get example after example of that, maybe we should be very cautious about before we reach to
yeah,
the military option. That's the view.
for
Look, at the
sure,
same time, we should be thankful. I mean, when you look back, we could have ended up in a nuclear war a number of times during
yeah,
the Cold War, but there was good leadership. We're very lucky to have people
yeah,
like JFK at the time. When you look back at that and resisting that, I suppose the big concern for everybody right now, let's face the elephant in the room, is that clearly there's no JFK in the White House right now. And
yeah.
where is that restraint on some of those voices that will be pushing towards conflict that might have a preference for that?
There were
So that's
people.
what worries everybody.
There were people at the time calling him an appeaser, too,
Yeah,
sort
of
of,
course, that's right. But
in the
yep,
Cuban Missile Crisis because you didn't, storm into, I don't know,
yep, hit the red button. Yep,
Odessa from Turkey or somewhere. But
yep, yep.
so yeah, and the other, I mean, other big one in the NatCons is immigration, and it's and the key thing, it's always been bubbling along immigration, right, as an issue, and it's a sensitive issue, and it's one that people don't want to kind of mainstream politicians don't want to engage with much because no one wants to be being called insensitive or racist or even not expressing sort of an appreciation of different cultures, which I think kind of most people do, and interest and stuff. But I feel like in the last couple of years, because of the dramatic uptick, and again, Australia has done better than Europe and the United States because we've been able to control illegal immigration
Yes, yeah,
in a way that Europe simply hasn't, and the United States.
yeah,
I mean, you wouldn't have in Australia the politicians saying illegal, well, apart from the Greens, but saying immigration is
yeah.
an act of love. But you literally had a Republican
Mm.
presidential candidate saying that. I mean, it's sort of jarring a little bit to the Australian ears. But we have had significant, we've had mass immigration, legal immigration to Australia over a long period of time since the end of the Cold War, and certainly ramped up in the last couple of years. And then ACCOM guys are saying, well, look, it's not just the illegal immigration which is the issue. We need to have a think about whether, with no animus towards any other cultural thing, but whether when you're building nations, you need to we need to put a pause on it for economic and a whole host of other reasons. What do you think? How do you
Well,
deal
again,
with?
it comes back. I suppose it comes back to the theme we're saying here that
Yeah.
what national conservatism is about restoring balance, restoring common
Mm,
sense
mm,
to the political debate, and sometimes that's not as sexy as people like. But I mean, my version of national conservatism is not to say that the migration rate should be zero. It's to say that it needs to be set in a balanced way
mm,
that meets the priorities of our country. Our formula for success is to put the interests of our country first. And
mm,
then we design our migration intake, our defence settings, our trade policy settings, everything with
mm,
that goal in mind. So we're not putting the goal in mind that, we need and must help every poor and vulnerable person in the world. That can't be and shouldn't be our goal. It only leads to disaster, which we've
mm,
seen in those countries you've mentioned. Now, we're so lucky as a country. I think we're pushing our luck right now with a lot of our policies, but we have been so lucky on the economic front with the mining industry, as I mentioned. On this front, on the migration front, we're very lucky to have Tony Abbott. It's his crowning achievement to have stopped those boats, stopped them in their tracks,
mm,
and remove this almost seemingly impossible to fix issue that exists in the US and Europe. So we're lucky. Our geography helps, obviously, but
mm,
it was a massive effort to do what Tony Abbott did, and it's effectively now bipartisan policy, as you say. Obviously, there's still people in the Labor Party that would wish it be otherwise, but I think the political reality restrains them from doing anything too crazy now, like they did in the Rudd era. So we're very lucky to have that. But we still have this issue that on the legal immigration front, we have not, since COVID, been setting, probably a bit before that too, have not been setting those numbers with the overall welfare of the Australian people in mind. We've been setting those numbers based on Treasury's preference to boost tax revenue and achieve some artificial budget position. That's what's been happening. And I was in the cabinet rooms when this happened without revealing all cabinet discussions. The big issue here is that every time a government seeks to reduce their migration rate, you'll have a Treasury Department come along and say, well, that will cost X billion dollars to the bottom line, to the budget bottom line. And under our, good budget rules, that has to be accounted for. You have to produce savings for it, and it becomes very difficult. But we can all see the consequence of these kind of artificial, arbitrary, and ultimately incomplete Treasury estimates is now this massive housing crisis that's blowing out the budgets of both the Commonwealth and state governments because they're desperate and responding in a haphazard way to the fact that many Australians' only option for a house is a tent right now. That is the consequence of, clearly the direct consequence of taking in 500,000 migrants a year while building far less now than 200,000 houses a year. We have to change that math.
Yeah. So, I mean, from a pure economic perspective, should Australia be dependent? I mean, it's almost as though we're an immigration-reliant economy. And
well, yeah,
I notice, and I'm not, maybe it was always in the ether, but I notice the use of per capita economic growth seems to be much more used, a lot more in the press than it probably ever once was. People
I think because people are feeling it. People are feeling that the headline economic statistics don't match, their everyday reality. So the news has to catch up at some point. So, I mean, I wouldn't say our economy is reliant on migration. It's our budget rules, which are a bastard version of what is actually happening in our economy. It's too narrow a focus. And that's what needs to change. The focus needs to change on how we make decisions in Canberra. We closed our border for 2 years, completely closed it. We were okay. We survived. Obviously, I still think, as I say, it's helpful to take in some migrants in what is a growing country, a developing country. We need the skills and people to achieve those goals. If we completely took it to zero, we would restrict our ability to grow as a country. No doubt about that. So it's just about being common sense and sensible about it. But the other aspect here is that we do have an issue, obviously, like most Western countries, with our birth rate. And if we're not going to be able to lift the number of Australians having a child, then we are going to become obviously more and more reliant on migration.
Yeah, but it wasn't always the case. I just I wonder, when you talk about this common sense and the balancing stuff, in the lead up to the last election, I remember Albanese's Prime Minister Albanese saying he wasn't going to match the numbers that the Morrison government was giving to in terms of legal immigration, and I think it was about 160,000 a year.
Well, we were sitting at, depends. COVID, obviously, we were doing almost nothing. Yeah. Before COVID, it was about 200,000 a year.
Yeah, but during the early 2000s, it got up to closer to 300,000 as well, and that's obviously doesn't include all of the international students and temporary visitors and stuff. So it really does sort of add up. But Prime Minister Albanese, or opposition leader Albanese at the time, said no, he wasn't going to match that, and then completely blew it out of the water by a factor of 5. And Peter Dutton is committed to bring it down for a couple of years before moving it up again. But we're still so much higher than we previously were used to in Australia.
Well, Peter's going to bring it down to 160,000. So depending on when you take the average over, I did this in Senate estimates a few months ago. The average of the last 10 years or so has been about that too, like taking out the COVID years, I should say. Taking out the COVID years, the last decade or so has been a couple of 100,000 a year. Over a 20-year period, it's been a bit lower than that, about 180,000 a year. Yeah, there was a bit of a surge around the first mining boom, but it softened out a bit. So those are the rough figures for the last couple of decades. Peter Dutton has said we'll get it down to 165,000 a year for the next few years if we were elected to office. So that is significantly below the average. Whereas what Anthony Albanese suggests is he'll halve the current migration rate, which is sitting at 560,000 a year. So halving it to 270 odd thousand, 280,000 is still obviously way above the long-term average, because he's halving it from a very high base. So that's I think the difference politically now going forward in numbers, in mathematical numbers, and I think 120 odd thousand people a year will make a big difference to our housing market and general livability in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I always think, because I grew up in Townsville, as you know, and it's probably, I think we're higher than that there in Townsville, but it was always just consider Townsville about 140, 160,000 people.
Yeah, about 200,000 now, but
now that's it's amazing how they grow. But that's a lot of people. I mean, to me, that's so you're talking about new Townsville a year.
Well, at the moment, we're importing Canberra a year. Canberra's about 500,000 now, so a little bit more than Canberra a year. We took 100 years to build that. We took 100 years to build Canberra. It's coming up to his 100th birthday.
And obviously, I still think it's 80% that end up in Sydney and Melbourne. So you're talking Townsville. It's not just 1 year, every 3 years, a new Townsville. You can't build another Townsville.
Can I add something else here to the National Conservative agenda? So I do support moving the migration rate down. I do support pronatal policies, and lots of ideas there. But I also think one thing we don't talk about enough is we need to build new cities. Like we should be, as part of our conservative viewpoint, we should be a pro-development, pro making this country bigger and stronger and better over time. And we do need to build new cities. We can't. I mean, there seems to be this conception, including on our side of politics, that what we need to do is just get rid of these pernickety councils and NIMBY people who are stopping large-scale apartments going up all over the place. Now, for one, as a conservative, I'm kind of NIMBY too. I believe in supporting those local communities. Maybe they don't want to live in Singapore. That's perfectly fine if that's their viewpoint. And I'll respect and support their judgment on that. Particularly when we have so much the rest of the country. Not everyone has to live in Sydney. We can develop new places which don't have to look like Singapore or Hong Kong, which people can have a backyard in. But we definitely need to have some government-directed support here to build the infrastructure, create the jobs and opportunities in these areas to attract people to live. And there really is no one, I think, discussing this in a major way right now. The answers to our migration housing issue seem to be concentrated on the unachievable, which is somehow getting councils to release land that's going to get them all voted out of office. Good luck with that. Or secondly, in my view, only temporary patches, which is to lower the migration rate. That will help for a little while, and we should do it. We'll provide immediate relief. But over time, if we're still taking in 160,000 people a year, as you say, it's still a lot of people, and we're not building new cities, we'll still end up with these housing issues. They'll just be delayed. We'll just be kicking the can down the road.
Yeah. Well, it's always been part, if you broadly define, if you go back to look at what Alexander Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln, who were in favor of, part of the platform was always high tariffs, but internal improvements.
Internal improvements, they called it.
That was the language they used, which were railways and roads and dams in Washington, D.C., which was part of the whole, because they...
Well, Menzies built Canberra. Like, he was a conservative. He effectively built Canberra. It's a beautiful city. I live there with 3 kids there. It gets a bad rap, but it's actually a really nice place to live. It's been a very strong growing place. That's why. It reflects why it's a good place. You can do that. It's not a particularly nice location. I don't think it's freezing cold. It depends what you like. But it shows to me, okay, I'll take another example. Melbourne, every time I fly into Melbourne, I'm like, this is a featureless, windswept hole of a location. That's why it gets these 4 seasons in one day. It has no mountains or ranges protecting itself, no real natural features. But it's a beautiful city, or it was a beautiful city before Dan Andrews wrecked it. But it's a beautiful city because it was built off the back of gold, and you spend enough money. I mean, Singapore, we mentioned, is another example. I mean, I don't want Australia to look like Singapore, but it's an amazing place built on the equator. It's a terrible, it's a swamp. It's a marshland, basically, on the equator. But it's a place where plenty of people like to live because there's enough money spent making it a nice place to live. So I get very frustrated, Dan, when I hear from people, particularly, say, my West Australian friends, who say, oh, no one wants to live in Karratha. It's too hot and too this and that. Like, have you been to Singapore? And, plenty of people live there. Yet we have, tying this back to the defence points we made earlier. The Pilbara, right? The Pilbara, where Karratha is the biggest city of the Pilbara, 30-odd thousand people. It's home in total to 60,000 people, the Pilbara. It's got an economy that's bigger than 120 countries in the world. So if it was its own country, it would be about the 60th or 70th biggest economy in the world. And it has 60,000 people. We are mad. We are crazy. We must and should be building a bigger place around Karratha, Port Hedland, if nothing else, just to defend that location, which is really the only part of the country that would be desirable to any other nation. I mean, we've got a great place, but from a resource perspective, from a strategic perspective, it's the iron ore, the oil and gas in the Pilbara that is actually that would be the target. And yet we have 60,000 people defending it. It's a joke.
Yeah. I'll wrap it up soon. But it's so true. We need to spend, as a nation, you have these resources, and I feel like the mentality in many ways was, or in some quarters was, what we need to do is just completely remove the role of government from anything and just create this economic zone, this kind of platform where anyone can come and play, and there's no real definition regarding the nation, and there's nothing for us to do. And when you go back and read those great men on Mount Rushmore and elsewhere, and Bob Menzies and all the rest of it, they were much more motivated by developing the country, creating a character of the country. They weren't completely standoffish, and they weren't investing in. There was a certain, because of our ability to produce things, I feel like there was, public servants like Leo Hilshire and other people had they were tinkering with their power, and they had a much more practical understanding of what could work and what, rather than the paper shufflers in public service.
Well, and hopefully this could be something, if you're doing this seriously here in Australia for a national conservative movement, it could be something uniquely Australian in Western countries almost, addition to that agenda, because in Europe in particular, obviously, they're not so focused on development. There's no real pioneers left or pioneering locations in Europe, even in North America to a certain degree, that they're much longer history than us, double the sort of years of industrial development than our country. Yet there are seriously still parts of this nation which really are pioneering locations. I mean, it was only in the last couple of generations that the Pilbara was opened up. It's very recent. It's very modern. There's parts of the Northern Territory which are just amazing opportunities, a massive shale basin there. There's really nothing there at all from an industrial perspective. And so we, as conservatives, I think we should capture that pioneering spirit. It's romantic. It's uniquely Australian. It connects back to what JD Vance's talking about, our home and our location. It's not just about an idea. The Pilbara is not an idea. It's a real place with real resources. It has distinct natural features and beauty that can be tapped for human development and advancement, as well as appreciating the natural environment too. And so, I'd love an Australian political movement to get behind that. And I'll just also finish, don't want to open up another can, but you talked about special economic zones. Another word for those is states. We could create new states, and that would be a special economic zone. Those states would have parliaments, they'd have governments, they'd have their own representatives. Yes, they'd have their own taxes, they could change and reduce, like Joh Bjelke-Petersen did in the day. They'd have their own senators as well. And that could have a big political change on our country if we had more states than the just measly old 6 ones we started with 120 years ago.
Yeah, I'm from North Queensland. You live in Central Queensland, and I do think whenever you go up there, there is a development sort of sense in the
mindset.
Air, right?
Yeah,
as a way that you people do things.
And I would say I grew up in Brisbane, and that used to be the mindset in Brisbane too. Not that long ago in my generation, but Brisbane's changed, and it's now tackling the issues of any congested large city, not focused on that development. There's no real state now in our federation that's like what Joh was back in the day, like what the Charles Court government was back in the day, which is focused on development of
Henry Bolte and the guys in South
Australia. Back in their days too, even further back. That's right. So no one's really playing that role in the federation at the moment, and that's why I think the federation is kind of dormant, and it's a little sad.
Final question, just to wrap it up. It's been a good chat. To what extent outside yourself? I mean, one of the questions prompted all this was this backbencher, Miriam Cates, influential backbencher in the UK, who attended that ARC forum in London. And she came up to me and said, look, what's going on with national conservatism in Australia? Because we were chatting about it. And I said, well, look, not very much, Miriam. And then I was chatting to different people in the whole ecosystem here. And John Roskin from the IPA, he's like, look, there's probably only about 10 people in Australia who understand what this is. Is there much discussion amongst sort of people in Parliament? Are they people? I think Alex Antic he described himself to me in his conversation as a national conservative. I've never heard anyone else say that. Are people, thinking? Even
I haven't really seen that label be used here in Australia. We tend not to focus too much, I suppose, on these broad and grand ideas.
Yeah.
We're kind of practical people, I suppose, in Australia. And there's no doubt there is a collection of people that at a practical level are thinking along similar lines that we've discussed today. And Alex is certainly one of those. And I've also mentioned Andrew Hastie, the Shadow Defence Minister, is certainly one of those. And look, I to go out on a limb here a little bit, I'd put Peter Dutton in that category too. I think one thing that hasn't been remarked enough on in the last month or two is how, in some senses, Peter has finally buried the anchor of the former Howard government on the Conservative movement. And I say that with great love and respect for the Howard government, and they did wonderful things at that time. But I've thought for some time that our movement seems to be a little captured by that era, and everything we do and say has to refer back to what would Howard do. There's this WWHD movement, and it's like, what would Howard do? We've got to do what Howard would do. And I love him. He's a great guy, great leader of this country. But the times are different. I think John Howard would be acting differently now, right? If we want to use his mindset, but I don't know if we have to. We can move on. And I'd say that in terms of why Peter's buried that in his decision to not only announce the removal of the ban on nuclear energy, but to say that he would build nuclear power stations as government-owned power stations. That's actually not a decision or a kind of decision you would really expect or fathom from the Howard government just 20 years ago. It wouldn't. I don't think would have happened. They did take some nascent efforts to remove the nuclear prohibition, but it was always couched in the sense that would then lead to private sector interest in doing this. But there's been, I think, a recalibration of our movement to say, look, there has to be a role for government in the basic development of a country, in the provision of basic natural services like energy. And as I say, not many people have commented on that. But if you want to call that national conservatism, I'm not sure if Peter would accept the label. As I say, we don't really worry too much about labels. We're just worried about what practically we can do to better the lives of Australian people. And I think the delivery of more reliable energy, including government from a government-owned company, will improve the lives of the Australian people. So let's do it.
Cool, man. I really appreciate your time. I've kept you too long. Enjoyed the discussion and look forward to seeing how this develops in due course.
One of the problems of looking down the barrel, I have no idea what time it is, but I've really enjoyed the discussion, so time must have flown. Thanks.
Okay, leave it to it. Thanks again. Bye.